You are listening to the Bell Post. Welcome to the next episode of our podcast. And today we have a guest from California, and his name is retired Chief Patrick Jordan from the LA Sheriff's Office. Mr. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me on your show.
Well, I know you have your own podcast, and it's called, what is it called? Something with the Chief?
I actually have two. I have Briefing with the Chief is on Wednesdays is on kgridb.com, which you were a guest on, and then I do another one, Morning Coffee with the Chief on Pop Culture Minefield and Rumble. And that one I review law enforcement related movies with a couple of retired guys, and we just talk about the movie, our experiences, and what's going on today. So, two good shows.
I like to see what I can find out when I have a guest. And so I try to research them. And I have to tell you, it was hard to find out stuff about Patrick Jordan, California. And it took me a while, but I found out some information about you. I know that you're
Yeah.
originally from Detroit, Michigan. That's
Yes.
where you were born and raised. How would you describe growing up in Detroit, Michigan?
What you probably don't know is I'm the son of a police officer. So my dad was is now retired from Detroit Police Department as a lieutenant. And it's just a typical big city in the Midwest. It's way different than Los Angeles. But my uncle was a Wayne County sheriff, which is the county that surrounds Detroit. So it's Detroit's set in Wayne County. And then I had a twin sister, believe it or not, who
Oh,
also
really?
worked for the Detroit Police Department. So we were the only two. I had four other siblings. We were the only two that went into law enforcement.
So if you were going to say this was the biggest difference between Detroit and Los Angeles, what would that be?
Well, obviously the weather is way better out here in California. But they're both blue towns. They're both deep blue states. For the most part, I think Michigan is a little more purple now. California was a little more red when I got out here in 1981, but it's gone far to the left. But I would say in terms of policing, policing in January and February in Michigan just never appealed to me. Policing in Southern California in January and February is much better. Trust me. So,
So talk about growing up as a twin. My parents had four kids in 2 years and 5 months. So my youngest sisters are 11 months younger than me, and they're twins.
well, I'm very close. Of all my siblings, I'm very close to obviously my twin sister. In fact, I'm traveling back to Michigan this next week, and I'll be staying with her. Right? She has a nice house on the lake. But I had a total of five sisters, no brothers, and but when I was growing up, it was not unusual for everybody to have large families. That we had a
Hmm.
lot of Irish, which I am, Polish, German, in the area, and they were all Catholic, and everybody had large families. In fact, I married a Polish gal and from Michigan, and she has seven siblings, so just really big stuff. But my sister Sandy and I were always very close. Obviously, you go through school together, and it's like when I go home, it's like I never left. It's the same thing, that bond has never been broken. And I think politically, we're probably the two most closely aligned, and just attitude and how we act. We're very similar, although she's obviously a gal, I'm a guy, but we're very similar in terms of being even keeled.
I'm a father of two daughters, and so you grew up in a family of all girls. So talk about what's it like growing up in a house full of just girls?
Well, I was really happy my first child was a boy, so I finally outnumbered him, right? It was a little different. I think I went towards sports as I got older because my dad was always gone. My dad, he worked for Detroit Police, but he also was working on his master's degree. He was teaching at college. He always had a second job growing because at the time cops didn't make very much, and
Hmm.
we had a bunch of kids and we went to Catholic school, so he always worked hard, and so other than but it was also a little different when I grew up. So I'm in my early 60s. We didn't have Game Boy and
Hmm.
Nintendo and all this. You were outside playing with your friends,
Sure.
and mom would kick you out and say, "Be home when the street lights come on." So there's a lot more freedom. Um, but the great thing about being in a house with five sisters, a modest blue collar home, is I'm the one who got my own room, so which is very cool. So they all had to share. I got my own room. But I got into sports, and that's where I got some friends that are like brothers to me, and I'm gonna go back and see them here pretty soon too. They have a big party every May for all the guys who played football together, and so I'll go and see them.
You know, my dad used to always have 2 jobs as well, and he used to say that he had to have a second job just to pay for the milk bill when we were growing up. So I
Yes.
understand that, but, it's kinda crazy. So you graduated from high school in 1980. That's the year
Yeah.
after I graduated from high school,
Okay.
and so you decided just to go from Michigan and move to California. Talk about that for a moment.
Well, things were rough when I graduated high school. Things were depressed in Michigan. Michigan depends upon the auto industry. If you remember the 70s, we came out
Mhm,
of the 70s and the oil embargo and Detroit, the big four at the time. American Motors is now gone, right? But the big four at the time, they weren't really making the cars that had a great gas mileage, and so the foreign folks were Japan was making some inroads into the market, and the market share was going down. And when the big four in Detroit stumbles, everybody feels it, right?
mhm.
So when I got out of college, I did college, or I got out of high school, did college for about a year, was working a little bit, and I said, you know what? I'm just had a couple $100 in my pocket, and I decided to. I knew one person in LA, a family friend, that came out here. He had just gotten hired on the sheriff's department. He had been a retired, I'm sorry, a laid off police officer from Detroit. And I came out here. I wasn't old enough, and I just bided my time and applied for the sheriff's department and had three jobs while I did that and got on the sheriff's department.
You know, when I look at things like when we were growing up and now I have kids of my own that are grown up, I see things through 2 different perspectives. So, I see you deciding, "Hey, I'm in Michigan, it's not things aren't going well, I'm gonna move to California. I only got a couple $100 in my pocket, but hey, I'm young, I can do it." But I'm also seeing it as a parent. And
Yeah.
if I had my daughter come to me and say, "Hey, I wanna move to California, I've only got a couple $100 in my pocket," I'd be having a problem with that. How was your parents with your, thoughts of moving?
Well, you know what? There was a little rough with my parents at the time, and they didn't have a choice. I just said, "Hey, you know what? They laid down the law. You're going to follow our rules or get out." And I said, "Okay, I'm gone." I was working full time and going to school full time, and there was,
Mhm.
they had a trouble letting us grow into adulthood, right? And so I said, "Well, yeah, I don't have to stay. I'm
But
gone."
that's
They,
I think that's one of those, difficult transitions for a parent even
yeah,
to you've had complete control of your kids and you want them and you wanna mold them, and then I mean, I told my daughter one time, if she would just go to law school and repeat everything I've done and just tweak a couple of things, she could
yeah,
be really, really successful. And, she didn't really have any urge to go to law school.
yeah, yeah. No, my daughter quit college and went to be a ski bum for a while, but then went back, and now she's a nurse. So everybody has their
Mhm.
different path, and I ultimately finished my degree too in my 30s in political science, and so I took a path. I go back and my buddies say, "We can't believe you did what you did," because they all stayed home and yeah, had their family support. Because when I say my friend went back, I knew nobody in California once that guy went back a couple years later. And when I joined the sheriff's department, I didn't have any family members who had been legacy people. I had the neighbor, none of that. I built my own career on my own terms because I had no. I mean, when you go through the academy and you're in the academy, okay, I got to get home to get my
Yeah.
laundry. I got to shine my shoes. I got to pack my lunch for the next day, and I got to do my homework. And a lot of these guys, they all were born and raised there, right? They go home, their mom packs their lunch, their dad shines their shoes. They do their spelling words, whatever, to study, and mom picks their stuff up from the cleaners. I'm like, man, I got to get this all. I literally did it all on my own.
There are a lot of statistics that say if you quit going to school, like if you graduate from high school, you move somewhere and you're not going to college directly, then your chances of then going back to college and finishing go way down. I
Yeah,
mean, probably less than 30%. So, I mean, that speaks to you as an individual. It also speaks to your background of you were not afraid of hard work and you didn't have any problem with working and studying and doing all these multiple things like you saw your dad doing as you grew up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's something we miss. It's like they got a bill going in the legislature out here and it drives me crazy. This Democrat, she's in a very tight race with the Republican, and the Republican's been on my show, Patrick Gibson. He's running for the 40th Assembly District, but so she's in a tight rate and she's trying to get some relevance. So she's proposing a bill to limit the homework that kids get.
Mm,
Because her whatever 9-year-old was complaining about how much homework she gets, and I'm thinking to myself, God, uh, I worked every day that I went to high school. I worked every single
yeah,
day.
yeah,
On breaks, I
absolutely.
worked because I worked at the school. I was on the janitor squad, whatever. I worked, and then in the summer times, you painted the entire school, you scrubbed the floor, you did maintenance on radiators. I mean, every single day. It snowed. I went to school early and shoveled out the entrances so people can come in. That was my experience. And here, this politician. And I got through. Yeah, I didn't have the great grades, but I also did football, and
Hmm.
you're going to be surprised. I did competitive speaking, so it was an unusual combination, and we actually won the state of Michigan the first year that I did
Hmm.
it. For
I
the
worked from 16 all the way till current. The only three
Yeah,
years I didn't work was in law school. And I think the first year you can't work. And I was so scared of not doing well in law school. I did not work the whole time I was in law school. Not
well,
because I couldn't, wasn't poor, but because I wanted to give my all to law school.
so this nanny state where because my kids were busy. We made them. Hey, you had
Hmm.
to do two sports, one in the spring, one in the fall,
Hmm.
and they were in an honors and AP track. And if you didn't do a sport, you had to do an activity or you had to get a job.
Hmm.
You didn't get to come home and just sit on the computer. In fact, I had a rule: you couldn't use the computer for gaming Monday through Thursday. But once you finish your
Oh,
homework
wow.
on Friday, yeah. And so we were, our kids were busy. They talk about it, but you know what? My son is a president of a corporation now. They build houses, and my daughter's a nurse, so they're doing well.
Yeah, you can't ask for anything else but self-sufficient kids, really.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you move to California, you move around a little bit, you decide you're going to join the local police department till you find out what you're going to really do. Because you said, I think I saw somewhere where you said you needed benefits and you turned it into a career. So
Yeah,
did you just go with the police department because that's what you knew?
it provided a decent living for my dad and my uncle. I will say I chose the sheriff's department over LAPD because I saw what Detroit police was doing to my dad. He worked some really tough areas. I mean, Detroit is a tough town and had been a tough town for many decades. And so I applied for the sheriff's department. I figured I would start my education again, and my goal was to get my education done and then go to law school. However, by the time I finished my education, I had a family with kids,
Hmm.
and I did the cost benefit analysis, right? Well, what's the cost of time and actually dollar amounts to go to law school? How much time would I have to put in to get to where I'm at on the sheriff's department? Because by the time I finished school, I was already a sergeant, and I was looking good to be lieutenant. And I said, well, I like what I'm doing. I enjoy
Hmm.
chasing the bad guy. I was good at some of this stuff, and so I said, you know what? That may have been what I wanted to go, but life has taken me in a different direction. If I just put as much energy in the job as I would law school, I probably would be much more successful.
Well, I remember back in law school, I had so many friends who were married that, their marriage didn't survive law school.
Yeah.
And so I think back at about, I don't know how I would have even went through law school with some a significant other because I was, a little naive. Also, spent every waking moment in law school trying to catch up, I guess, or absorb and try to do well. And it was crazy. That was back when you would watch L.A. Law. I mean, that was
Hmm.
the only time the law school was empty. I was probably the only one in there when the L.A. Law episode came on. It was crazy. So talk about, you have how long were you at the sheriff's office? Like 30 something years?
38 years.
38,
So,
because I think you were still in the sheriff's office the last article I saw. I think an article about somebody, the local residents of Calabasas, and so I found
oh
a
yeah,
spotlight on
I
you,
was
and you were still there, and you'd been there 37 years. So you were there 39 years. Did you say?
38 years. I worked pretty much, except for courts. I didn't work courts. I pretty much did everything that you could do as a police officer. I mean, most people they don't understand sheriff's departments versus like LAPD or city police, but a large department like the LA County Sheriff's Department, the largest sheriff's department in the country, um, has just about everything that you'd get from a big city police department. But then you also have corrections, and you do the courts. And probably the biggest jobs that I had. I mean, I enjoyed being a detective, lieutenant in particular. I'm not so much a detective, but I worked the streets mostly. That's what I like to do. I did that at almost every rank. Or it, obviously, the higher you get, you're more just overseeing people that work the streets. But I also did a stint as an executive in custody, which probably will dovetail when we get into talking about bail reform, where I did a lot of things related to uh, anti-recidivism program. I worked with Kamala Harris's staff on a program called Back on Track LA, where we did wraparound services where with men who were medium to high recidivate. That led me to, overseeing all of the inmate programming in the jails. And a lot of these things help to shape my perspective as to are there opportunities for criminal justice reform beyond these ideologically driven efforts by the left? And I do think there are. I worked with the MacArthur Foundation in their effort to reduce jail population in LA County, and they learned a lot that they had a lot of misconceptions about LA. LA was much farther ahead, and I don't want to say progressive because these were solutions by necessity related to overcrowding.
From your time about recidivism, what do you think is the number one factor that determines recidivism?
Well, people define this recidivism how, whatever they want to get the benefit they want. I personally think if you want to know whether the person is recovered, and when you're looking beyond just a stat for criminal justice, if you want to know a person who's covered, if they've been released from prison and they've been arrested within the last 3 years, and there's significant evidence that they actually committed the crime, I think that should count as recidivism. We don't count that. We count conviction as recidivism, which is uh, uh, the recidivism, the definition of recidivism, and how to manipulate what is truly recidivism has been played with here in California. But I would say if you're released and within 3 years you're arrested, then you have recidivated. You're still in the
So,
game, so to
so
speak.
what's going to determine that from, the time you were looking at that issue, what would be things that would influence that more towards recidivism than trying to not have someone recidivate?
Well, I think if you're looking at a quality program to reduce recidivism so that you get, because really what we ought to be looking at, what they say there we're looking at is a more equitable outcome. That's why they want to do all of these programs. It's more about equitable outcome. But really, if you're driving your program to focus on the criminogenic factors, of the criminogenic needs of the criminal, of the person who's committing the crime, you stand a much better chance of being successful. This is why the blanket policies of left are not working because they're not focusing on the criminogenic factors.
You said not working.
They're not working because they're not focusing on the criminogenic factors that are evident in people that are medium to high recidivate. Until you actually focus on those things, you're going to fail over and over again. Simply doing blanket criminal bail, for example, doesn't you're not picking out those people who are most likely
Hmm.
to commit crimes and addressing them differently than those who are not, and that's why it's failing. You're taking different value judgments to decide, like race and income, to decide who you're going to deal with, and not looking at the criminogenic factors of the person that's committing the crime. When you start developing your programs to focus on them, you stand a much better chance to be successful. And when I say successful, I'm talking about incremental change. We're talking about
Sure.
we did a survey in the LA County jail system when I was involved because we helped to implement drug and alcohol treatment within the jails with the county, LA County Public Health. A lot of resistance there, but we did it, and we did a survey, and 85 to 90% had some level of addiction, whether it's alcohol or drugs. So one of the criminogenic factors is addiction issues, right? So if you start addressing the addiction issue, you at least get people sober to then you can start dealing with some of the more higher criminogenic factors like um, impulsive behaviors, a sense of entitlement, criminal
Hmm.
thinking, and hanging out with people who are criminally thinking, or if they don't have an education, you got to get them sober to start working on some of these things. But when you start focusing on, if you look at a program, because I would look at a program, if the program didn't address the criminogenic needs, I said, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
It's a waste of time and effort. It's a waste of money, right? And
Like
actually,
in Texas, the Harris County Jail has the largest mental health facility in the state of Texas. I'm assuming since LA County Jail is so large that it probably is comparable, has one of the largest mental health facilities in the state of California. Is that true?
It is. I mean, when I was for probably 8 or 9 months, I managed the jail population. So we had at the time about 18,000 inmates, and so it's like a big Tetris game. Everybody
Mhm,
comes in, they got a security level, they got a medical need,
mhm.
they got a charge level. They can't be with this guy, they can't be that guy, and so it's like a Tetris game. They're coming in, and you're trying to fit them into the custody somewhere. And I think at the time we had 3,500, and I think it's increased people who had some level of diagnosed mental illness that were under care by the mental health professionals that worked in the LA County jail system with us. So that's a lot. That's quite a bit because our population at the time was running about 18,000. Because each a lot of those people take there's special bed
Mhm.
needs that go with them, and special treatment needs, and escorts, and all that kind of stuff.
Well,
So
it also becomes a revolving door because they're off their meds, they get arrested, they get brought
yeah.
into the jail, they get on their meds, they settle down, they no longer need it, they're released, they get off their meds, and it just starts all over again.
Well, public policy makers, lots of times they'll focus the animus towards criminal justice and law enforcement as it relates to mental illness. But if you break down, well, how are we failing that we're not treating our mentally ill? It has nothing to do with law enforcement. Law enforcement has
Mhm.
become,
Yes.
the backstop to try
Mhm.
and deal with it as best they can. They've become the on-ramp into treatment as we're starting to do treatment. And it's not really a failure of the criminal justice system. It's a failure of the very same people that they now say are going to be the people who solve the problem. That's through care
Well, and
versus
it's like you see schools have failed, inner cities
yeah.
have failed, drugs is rampant, and gangs are rampant, and so you see sense of family is failed, and we have all these programs to help these, and they've all failed or they are failing in our urban areas, and so do we fix those? No, we say we need to fix the criminal justice system,
Yeah.
which was never intended to address mental health. It was meant for to address public safety. But now we're going to fix it all in criminal justice reform.
Yeah, I think your listeners need to hear this. So in California, to commit somebody, when I was working, 5150, which means to commit somebody for a 72-hour mental health observation hold, they had to be gravely disabled, a danger to themselves, a danger to others, and a psychiatrist could do that, a doctor, and a police officer. That's who could do it. So when they start yelling and screaming, we need social workers, the reason why the cops are the ones doing it, because when somebody, broke down or decompensated at 3 o'clock in the morning, the people who were up to deal with it were the cops. You know,
Well, but the police, the county, they don't have the ability or the expertise to triage a situation like that and say, "Oh, you know what? We don't need to send police. We can send a social worker." And then what happens when they triage it wrongly? That's a guaranteed lawsuit from the
yeah,
family
oh,
of that
absolutely.
social
And
worker. It's set
well,
up for failure, in my opinion.
I can tell you, there was not when we were dealing with the mentally on the streets, there really wasn't a big support network for cops who had to
Hmm.
deal with these folks all the time. And so and here's the other part on the mental illness thing, because a lot of the people on the left they'll say if a person's mentally ill, then that's kind of king's X on them committing crime. Well, that's not the truth, right? As
Yeah,
you
it's
know, as
not.
an
Hmm.
attorney, people still have the capacity to know and understand what they're doing. Mental illness doesn't necessarily mean they're incapable of understanding that or that they're incompetent to stand trial, is how they use it legally. They're unfit to stand trial because of their mental illness. Many of them can clearly form intent and do so and commit the crimes. And so because of they're mentally ill and they're not functioning or they choose not to function in society on their medication, they turn to crime to support their habit or support their lifestyle, even and 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 they are mentally ill. So, for me, it's like we got thrown into the criminal justice system because a lot of them had turned to crime to support themselves as they lived on the streets,
Hmm.
or they rejected um, societal norms to try and live like everybody else.
I think that's so important when you say, by some of our policymakers, they're arguing that King's X mental health means we can't prosecute them, but then the counties can't afford to take care of them. So in the end, the result is you just release them. to commit another crime or to get off their meds, get unmanageable, and that's what starts the revolving door. But today I want to talk about California criminal justice system and how we've gotten to where we are today. And and looking at this issue, look in 2020 there was 4.4 murders per 100,000 people in that area, and that was down from 13.1 murders per 100,000 in 1983. That's now all been undone and changed. I mean, it just seems like uh, so much work has been wasted in the name of what we call bail reform.
Yeah, I think the last year I looked, it was at 5.7, and I did the math. If you go from 2014 when they passed Prop 47, so that was they did a bunch of landmark or bunch of reforms, but that was probably the biggest one with the biggest changes. And when you looked at the number of murders from 19 or I was there 2014 to I think it went to 2022, over 2,000 more people had died in California. So, because I use the benchmark as 2014, and here's the other part of this. We
Mhm.
hear the liberals saying, "Well, it's not so bad." Well, they want to benchmark themselves against the worst year we ever had, 1993. And actually, no, we should be benchmarking ourselves against the best year we ever
Mhm.
had, and that was 2014 when crime was the lowest. But when you use that as the baseline and add up all the murders, we're talking 2,000 more murders over time. And here's where I have a problem with the politicians. I'm a guy who's willing to try projects in criminal justice reform. I've actually piloted them and implemented programs that are working now and have a high success rate. But I recognize that there might be some failures along the way, and I want to tell people what those risks are. What we have now is policymakers that shame and blame, and when crime goes up, they don't want to acknowledge that they knew it was going to happen. They don't say to the public, because if they sold Prop 47 correctly,
Oh
they'd have
yeah.
said that, instead of the Safe Streets and
Mhm.
Safe Schools Act, and that title was given by Kamala Harris, who was Attorney General at the time, if she'd have said there's a strong likelihood that we will see an increase in crime, um, it's unknown how much until the benefit of this gets into place. And it probably would not have passed. What do you mean an increase of crime? Because then she'd have got asked by that, and she never, nobody
We
ever asked her because she labeled it Safe Streets and Safe School Act.
we know when I look at California, I kind of went researching how did this all start, and when you look,
Yeah,
you trace it all the way back to this case called Coleman versus Brown and Plata versus Brown, and they weren't attacking jail overcrowding; they were attacking something unique, or it was I thought it was unique to me. In the Coleman case, they were attacking the state's ability to provide mental health care. And in the Plata case, they were attacking the state's ability to provide medical care to the state prison population. And so this whole three-judge panel that was put into place that limited bed space in the state prison to 137.5% or 4% of capacity was based on the state's inability to provide competent medical care. And that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, decided 5-4 to affirm. But I would argue that the judges in the minority, the dissenting judges, are now in the majority. But I mean, Alito just gave a stinging criticism saying we're ordering the state to release the equivalent of 3 divisions of criminals,
yeah.
46,000 people, and it's convicted criminals. He said we should not be harboring that, and he was like, "This is overbroad. We're doing across the board, release. We're not looking at someone and saying, 'Okay, you didn't get the proper medical care you should have gotten, so we're releasing you.' We're just doing a King's X on everybody. And contrary to what we keep hearing, oh, this will reduce crime. We'll be more safe by releasing more criminals. Alito was quoting that we're going to get the same result that we've seen in other jurisdictions that have tried this. And I think he referenced Philadelphia and says the result they get is more crime. And yet what we hear from California is releasing more criminals will make us safe over and over.
Yeah, they're lying, and but you're seeing a shift here. So let me go back. There's a couple things you said there that I don't think there is absolutely a concerted effort to discredit the criminal justice system in a variety of ways, and you can see it with the death penalty thing. They challenge the death penalty. They make it so expensive, and that
Mhm.
because they appeal every chance they get, and then they say, look how expensive it is. Why are we
Yeah.
doing this? And yet they're the ones driving up the expenses with appeals that are nonsensical, right? And so they're driving, and so what there clearly is. I don't know who did those cases, whether it was the AGO who drove those cases against the state. I don't remember, but it was clearly to make it much more expensive to do the job. Because here's the other thing, most people, I look at, because I helped to run the LA County jail system, and we worked with our medical professionals. Many of the people who are coming to jail have zero consistent mental
Hmm.
and medical treatment. Zero. They're on the streets. Maybe they go to an emergency room.
Sure, sure.
And so when they come into the jail system, they have a much higher level of care than they have on the streets. We're not having somebody who's middle class for the most part going in the jail who's got a premium health care insurance, right? We don't have that. We have people who are living on the streets who have nothing, or they're in the criminal lifestyle. They don't have the group plan, through FedEx. I mean, they don't have any of that kind of stuff. And so you're getting a higher level of treatment. So I'm not sure what benchmark they use in those cases, but when you look at a lot of our criminals, they don't have access to this to begin with. So this is the first steady plan that they have. But secondly, I think again I go back to, even though we're talking about the criminal justice system failing, the prisons failing, the fact that we had so many people mentally ill
Hmm.
in the state prison system, in the LA County system, is a failure of our policymakers and those who implement policy. And we've seen right now with some huge failures on the part of this administration now. $20 billion lost to fraud, much of that fraud being driven by inmates in the state prison system and it wasn't workman's comp, it was unemployment insurance. And then another $20 billion unaccounted for dealing with the homeless. Where did we spend it? Where did it go? Did we get
Sure,
any results? And this is what's going on. The left right now in California is genuflecting towards what they see as the priorities. Look, we spent all this money on these priorities, but they're not getting any results. And this is why I have some real frustration with the criminal justice reform, because I'm a results-driven person. So show me a plan that works.
sure,
And they're spending a lot of money. They've increased their programming in the state prison systems, but they haven't seen any real result. In fact, they don't even do a report on recidivism. The last one they did, I think they evaluated the cohort from 2014, 2015. And the reason you don't do more is because the numbers aren't working out for you. That's why you don't do it. I did find some numbers where they had like 68% of those released from state prison were rearrested within 3 years, which is a
sure.
really bad omen
Bad.
and
Yeah.
indicates failure, right? But we're not even talking about that kind of stuff. So, but I agree with you. The whole goal was to close down what they see as the incarceral industry in California and reduce that. And they were not honest with the public as to what that will mean for them in their communities.
After the case was resolved, it seems like the next thing that happened is the state pushed some of the state prisoners in the state system down to the county because they saw that the county jails had 10% free capacity and they were over capacity. So they pushed a whole bunch of prisoners down to them, which I think in effect forced the counties then to release them. So then it was on the counties, not on the state policymakers. And then you've already mentioned Proposition 47. When you look at it in this light, you can say the whole purpose of Proposition 47 didn't have anything to do with crime. It was just to reduce jail population. And when they're saying, and I'm real critical of Right on Crime, other conservative groups who jumped on board with that, and because when you look at the history of this, it just jumps out at you that the whole purpose of the policymakers had to know what they were doing was going to increase crime, and they didn't care because they had to reduce the jail population, and that was their number one goal. Period.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because it's the very same, because it was Jerry Brown, I think, who started getting tough on crime back when he was first governor.
Hmm.
I want to say in the 70s, and he stated that he had regrets, and now he felt like he was correcting. I mean, these are some of the statements that he said. But I was on the streets when in '93, and we saw a lot of politicians who lean left who pushed for tough on crimes legislation. A lot of
Sure.
people on both parties supported three strikes in California. And it was, in fact, I had a Republican sheriff who questioned the wisdom of three strikes as it ultimately was adopted in the state, because he saw it as being problematic, and that was Sherman Block. And he said this is going to cause overcrowding, like we haven't seen, and this is not a good idea. So there were some people who were saying maybe not, because what he was, I think the argument he was saying is maybe we should wait till you should give these strikes, the types of strikes you have. If you had a violent strike and two, maybe we needed two violent strikes versus one. He was just he was suggesting maybe we were be a little softer on it, and that was coming from Republicans because he was a long-term sheriff. He saw the fallacies, the public policy fallacies of what they were trying to do, but they wanted to capture that tough on crime thing from Republicans, and they did. And this is where I feel there's a betrayal against law enforcement. As soon as they could shed themselves of that
Hmm.
issue, they did, but they turned it and blamed it all on law enforcement. So they passed the policies, gave us the money to enforce those policies, pushed us to enforce those policies, made sure that we were on the stand behind them when they're doing their campaigns and
Sure.
their press conferences. And then when they wanted to switch the narrative, they blamed it all on systemic racism on the cops and pretend and wash their hands and pretend like they had nothing to do with it. That to me, that is a huge betrayal of our political leaders.
Well, we've already mentioned Prop 47 a couple of times, but I just want to make it clear for people from Texas and around
Yeah.
us that what Proposition 47 did was it changed or reclassified certain felony offenses down to misdemeanors. And the argument was this is going to help them get jobs, but they will still answer for their crimes. The problem then became we have certain DAs in certain of our urban areas that elected or said we are no longer going to prosecute those misdemeanors. And, that's what kind of formed the policy of theft under $950. We're not going to prosecute anymore. And that kind of started this whole lack of accountability and rise in crime. And it seems like a lot of times, well, I mean, is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So Gascon actually co-wrote Prop 47, and then he became the DA in Los Angeles County. Now, there's a one critical piece that I think most people need to understand because it's whether it's I think it's Jose Garza in Travis County, Texas, and it's Joe Gonzalez in Behar, Texas. I mean, similar strategies. They're not filing drug charges for the most part. In LA, they call them addiction charges, and those he stopped charging those. But Prop 47 also talked about, well, we'll use the money we saved on incarceration on treatment. However, if you're not pushing people into
Yeah,
these programs, you're not going to get a result. And I'll give you so one pilot I worked on with the MacArthur Foundation was the rapid diversion program, and we started out with misdemeanors, and it was agreement between the public defender, the city attorney, LA city attorney, and the judge. And our my role was peripheral in that I helped supply data and I gave uh, because we managed the jail population, so I had the data and we could track the data, and then I had to help them with some security issues in the courts. And they all came to an agreement that once a person was cited, and this was on Skid Row, so where we have this high population of mentally ill, homeless, addicted folks, that once they were arrested for a minor crime, they would be evaluated by a mental health professional. Their needs would be determined, and they would be offered. You want to go through the criminal process, or do you
sure.
want to? Now, this was a problem with this because lots of times defense attorneys don't want them talking to anybody, right? So there had to be an agreement in place where they're all working together holistically to get this done, right? And then once it was determined what their needs were and they said, yeah, I want treatment, then a navigator was used, and this is where MacArthur came in. They paid for the navigator, and we'd direct them to a bed. And that has a 90% success rate. But what we're talking about is we're looking at the system working together. No ideologues here. Everybody's saying, okay, we all have different interests in the system, but we all want to get a better
Yeah, but
outcome
that
than we're getting.
90% success rate relies heavily on accountability. I
It
mean,
does, and
if you
and
don't have accountability, or if you're not, if it becomes, oh, it's a drug charge, so it becomes a
yeah.
King's X, and we're not going to provide, I mean, we're not going to have any accountability. Your success rate goes down, way down then.
Exactly. And my point in telling that story is when Gascon decides that he's going to a whole host of these charges he's not going to file because I forget what the percentage is of how many people chose. It was lower. More people chose jail versus going
Sure.
into the system, right? But you're getting it was a fairly significant percentage that chose. And it like this program has been in place for 5 years and only 2,000 people have gone through it and they track
Hmm.
it for 3 years. So
Sure.
the success rate is pretty good.
Well, but
But
that also tells you how expensive it is. Very few people went
exactly
through it
it,
because it's so expensive.
and that's why I say, hey, we could do criminal justice reform, but success is going to be incremental. And what
Hmm.
Gascon did when he became the DA is he refused to file any of those charges. So first he lowered them felonies to misdemeanors,
Hmm.
then he refuses to file any of them. But there's something that most people don't know, and most people should know this because you got to be watching your Soros-funded DAs wherever you're at. Is they stopped charging weight for dealers. At least Gascon did, and I was not aware of this. I had a guest on my show, Judge Craig Mitchell. He ran for DA, and he explained he had somebody in his courtroom. This is one of the reasons why he ran, who had 22 kilos of methamphetamine. Now that's 44 pounds of meth. That's a lot, and it's made with P2P, which is causing psychosis. So it's a big part of why we have growing homelessness, right?
Sure.
And he expected that the DA's office would file the weight enhancement on that charge. They did not. This guy got a slap on the wrist. So here's a drug dealer. He gets a slap on the wrist. He did 10 days time served and he's out. Now
Whoa.
right. And here's what they're saying. So guess what says, well, we're holding him accountable, and Mitchell said not really.
Not
And
really.
here's the narrative that most of these guys are putting out there. We don't want to go back to the tough on crime, war on drugs kind of approach that we did with crack cocaine. We don't want to do that. But they're doing it also with dealers who are selling poison. And I'll give you an example. So when Gascon came in office in 2020 till 2022, the overdose deaths went from 2,700 in LA County to 3,200. So that's a 500. So that's just from 2020 2022. So I don't remember what it was an increase, a steep increase. So 2021 also had so we're talking like 800 more people died if you
Hmm.
use his benchmark his first year. So when he implemented that policy, I'm not going to charge anybody for use and possession. He guaranteed that we will have a steep increase in overdose deaths due to narcotics. And that's a number that nobody's looking at. I've been looking at it for like 4 years and talked about it on every platform that I get a chance to talk about it. But if you look at it across these major metropolitan areas that have implemented these strategies, you're going to see that same dynamic occurring.
You can see that in Portland when they decriminalized all hard drugs. They set record numbers of overdoses every month. It's like we've given up on a generation of our citizens, and we're taking the easy road out. We're just going to say, hey, if you want to kill yourself, kill yourself. But we have treatment programs available. I mean, well, no one's using them. I think in Portland was less than 0.01% was saying they wanted to go through the programs because there's no hammer. You have, when
Yeah.
you say you can go to the treatment program or you can go to the criminal justice system, as long as you have the hammer of the criminal justice system, you've got a hammer and you've got a reason or incentive for them to go through the treatment program. And so if they fail, and these programs generally have a high failure rate, you have a reason to incentivize them to make them go back.
So Portland was following the Portugal model. So Portugal decriminalized in like 2001 or whatever, and they saw good numbers, but they put a lot of money in treatment
Yeah, and accountability too.
and accountability. However, what I was asked to speak on this thing, so I did the
Hmm.
research, and what I found out was going on in Portland is now experiencing an increase in usage. So they went from like 7%
Hmm.
of adults using to 12% of adults using regularly illegal narcotics, right? So that's a fairly steep increase, and they've also seen a dramatic increase in overdose deaths, which is what Oregon saw. But what they saw, and this was shocking to me, but I can see the natural progression of the mindset of the people who do this stuff. What they said is the mindset of the people who provide the treatment was that we need to get to a point where using hard drugs is considered a human right. So it went from we got to treat these folks to get them off drugs to we just need to make them stable and which means they got customers for life, right? And to me that was shocking because right now the narrative is treatment first,
But
and
when I hear that, I'm like, what would they be doing differently if they were working for the gangs and the cartels for these drug producers? What would they be doing differently if they were just advocating for them 100% of the time? I don't
well,
know anything they'd be doing different.
So you obviously you've studied the Constitution, right? And you studied the basis for Western political thought. And the bottom line is every individual has an obligation to contribute to the city state, is what the Greeks would say. You have an obligation to live a good life. You have an obligation to do the right thing. And, saying that no, I'm going to spend my life living this hedonistic lifestyle and just be on drugs means you're not really contributing as a true citizen. And so for me, I'm like, well, wait a minute, I can understand if you have some medical issue, but you're not making effort to contribute as a full citizen because of this addiction, and it's unfair for you to expect the rest of the citizens to carry you along the way. That's from a fundamental standpoint in terms of our obligation to citizen. I think that's a failure, and I don't think we should support that as our public policy goal. Period.
We should not be pushing people towards illegal, illicit drugs that change your minds. I mean, that alters your mental state and affects your ability to do things. And you then want you have an addiction, you want to get more, and you can only do it by stealing other people's stuff and committing crime. And then it becomes what we are seeing in some of our urban areas where we're like, oh, everybody has a right to do these things, and then if they have a right to do that, I mean, that's one. I mean, this is a big sidestep, and I one of the reasons why we have not decriminalized or, yeah, decriminalized prostitution is because if you do that, well, then if a a house of ill repute offers somebody a job and they turn it down, they lose their unemployment. I mean, we lose morality. We lose
Right? Yes.
morality.
Yeah.
But it seems like if you look through the history of California, you can see that a lot of the problem is a lack of capacity in the prison system. And I noticed that Arnold Schwarzenegger at one point in time put aside money to build more facilities, but that never happened. And it seems like until California decides that it is ready to invest more in capacity, we're in this cycle of just we got to push people away from the criminal justice system because we got a cap on, and we're not building more capacity.
Well, as anything, until it becomes an emergency on everybody's radar, meaning yeah, when you want to change public policy, it has to be high on the agendas on the agenda, and that's usually driven by failures, multiple failures, and people's frustration. And I personally think you're starting to see the pendulum swing because you saw Newsom go from housing first model on homelessness to now he's embraced the care courts, which allows law enforcement and others to commit people who have mental illness, inclusive of addiction issues, into a court where they would monitor their treatment. That's a big step for somebody like Newsom, who's been, far left and in camp with the folks on the far left. In fact, the leftists are mad at him for doing that. And you're seeing a real effort, and that this includes some Democrats, modern Democrats, where they're looking to repeal some aspects of Prop 47, right? Some of them are doing it kicking and screaming, and in fact, Newsom came out. We had 900,000 signatures to do some repairs on Prop 47, particularly bringing back essentially petty theft with the prior. Previous arrest for theft can give you a felony charge, right? And Newsom wants to step in there and say, no, drop the thing, and then we'll aggregate the amount that they're. It's a stupid idea because we don't have that capacity built in to do that. But it's really an effort for him to undercut it but to get ahead of it, right? But and also to keep it out of the initiative process because once it's initiative, as you know, it becomes constitutional, and then the legislature can't change it unless they do another initiative themselves. So, but at least you're seeing Newsom starting to address it. Before he would just say, "Oh, they're lying. They don't know what they're talking about. We're tougher than everybody else. Everything's fine. Nirvana is here." But now he's reacting to real criticism and real issues, which tells me they're afraid of this issue. They're
Well, I
afraid of the
tell you, their
crime issue.
polling says it's an issue.
Yes. And
So y'all have the LA district attorney who is a Gascon, and he was subject to a recall election, and they disqualified a whole bunch of of signatures, and he's running for reelection. So how is his running for reelection going? What's the status of the race?
well, let's a couple of things, and this is where if you're got a Soros funded DA, I think you guys need to keep something in mind. The local DA oversees election violations. You know what I mean? So there, and
Mhm.
so if you got a ideologically driven DA, then they can use their prosecutorial discretion not look at it, and then, of course, the state attorney general can step in, but with Bonta. But he's actually struggling. So, the person running against him is a former federal prosecutor, Nathan Hochman, right? The polls are showing that Hochman is doing well, uh, and uh, uh, and that Gascon only got about 25% of the vote in the primary, which is really unusual. Typically,
Yeah. You would think
account
an incumbent getting 25% of the elect of the vote in a primary for reelection would mean he cannot be reelected. It would in Texas.
Yeah, and right, and normally an incumbent would just they'd win it out in the primary with 50 plus
Yes.
1% of the vote, right? And that's not happening. And so now he's in a dogfight, and he knows it. I think there'll be money coming in. They're going to cast Nathan Hochman as some kind of right wing. He did run as a Republican for state attorney general. He lost, and now he's running as an independent. I don't think. I don't think it'll go anywhere. He'll be on my show, Briefing with the Chief on KJADB.com. Nathan Hochman will be on in 2 weeks. And I'm going to talk to him about, because he's got a lot of issues on reform on his website. So I'm going to talk to him about some of those things. So as they try to cast him as a far right winger who just wants to put everybody in prison, I'm going to dig into some of his policy issues and where he's going to go with them. And that's the thing, because I worked, did a lot of these criminal justice reform pilots. I can read the stuff. I can understand what George Gascon is talking about, and I can say where he's taking it out of context. And so I want to give Nathan Hochman a chance to talk about those things because they won't. They'll just label him a right winger. And as you know, I do kind of a long format show. So I think Hochman is looking pretty good. Now, he just had a real boost this week. So a lady named
Mm.
Diana Tran, who's George Gascon's number three, was just indicted 11
Yeah,
felonies
I saw that. It's incredible.
yeah, stealing the file. And I interacted with this lady. I'm not surprised, right? And I overturned some of her cases when I became a chief, and she was gone. And she was in charge of the ethics and integrity division for the DA's office. She was in charge of looking at convictions and overturning convictions for murders, and I think they did things underhanded. I talked about one of those on my show, the Jack Williams murder. He was a deputy that was killed in 1979. They tried to get his killer out, and and this case may have tentacles and go to the inspector general who does oversight over the LA County Sheriff's Department. It sounds like Gascon knew that they were using files they shouldn't use in cases against deputies or in criminal cases. That's the indictment sealed, so I can't see exactly what they're saying, but in the news reports and other people talking, that's what's being suggested. So this is really damaging for him because he's running on I'm going to hold cops accountable.
Mm.
And yet his number three, and who's in charge of
Yeah.
doing that, was just indicted with 11 felonies for lying and cheating while
Or not
trying to
playing
hold
fair.
cops accountable,
Yeah,
right?
not playing fair.
She was violating the exact same law. Because here's the thing, I explained to it when somebody asked me about this. If I had violated the section she's talking about, and I think it's 502 C2 of the California Penal Code, if I was a sitting chief and I violated that, and she was doing oversight over my case, even though I had just as much oversight and accountability on the troops as she did, she would make sure that I was prosecuted to the full extent of the law. That's what she would do. Now she's been caught doing it, and she's suggesting, well, I was just doing my job. Well, no, that's not how it goes. But I think this is very damaging for him, this particular thing, because Hochman gets to come back. What do you mean accountability for police? You can't even
Yeah,
keep your
yeah.
own house in order because you got your own DAs are violating the law. So
Well, what does
I
that
think
say about their personality that they would prosecute on the one hand, but then they would do it and they think that they're above the law? I mean, that's really, I mean, they can decide, they're like kingmakers.
yeah, they've decided that the ends justify the means. And, for me to get what I want, I don't believe, they make value judgments on different personnel. I mean, I read one case where I overturned it where they actually went into an employee's pre-employment jacket, which you're not supposed to do, found something there that they didn't like, which the department had already said was not a big deal, and then discussed that in a force case that he was involved in where they said, nah, the force was okay. But the executive said, well, because that's there, because this is Diana Tran did this, because that's there, we'll just go ahead and fire. And they never told him why they fired him.
Mm,
He ended up getting his job back because there were other issues with the case. But um, to me, you can't do that. Everybody has a right to due process. You have a right to face your accuser. You
Yeah,
have
we
right to
have
know
a
why you're getting
situation
fired.
right now going in Harris County, which is Houston, third largest county, I think, in the country. But the DA, it's DA is DA is a DA. DA is a Democrat. Kim Ogg was elected 3 elections ago. She received money from Soros, and then she decided that they were pushing bail reform too far. And so when she came up for reelection, she did not get any money from
Yeah.
Soros, and she became kind of what I would call a moderate. And she was stronger on law enforcement. She was, I mean, I would say she was bearable, but she pulled back and said that they went too far. And then we just had our primary in March, and they came after on the left with a fully funded Soros backed person who contributed 1.5 to $2 million in the primary. He had $4 million he spent in the primary, spanked her. The the Democratic Party party chairs all endorsed him and sanctioned her, saying she wasn't quote unquote Democrat enough. And now the Soros candidate has, I've listened to a podcast where he was on it just in the last couple of weeks. And the first thing he said was, I think George Soros just gets a bum rap. He just gets a
Right.
bad rap. And the other thing is he's trying to track to the middle, even though he's made all these comments. He's going to reduce the jail population and by half in 4 years. And the other thing, he just in this podcast, oh, we're going to try a whole bunch more cases, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to waive jury trials.
Well, they're going to lie, and they just had a race in Chicago. Clayton Harris was going to try and replace Kim Foxx. He was farther left to Kim Foxx, and a judge stood up and said, "No way, this is Eileen O'Neill Burke in Cook County," and she took him on, and she leans left. So it's not like she's a right winger. She leans left, but she said, "Hey, I'm going to follow the law," and she barely squeaked in a win in the primary, which means she'll probably go on and win. But I think, the lady that lost in Harris County. Here's the thing that, and Hockman has pointed it out when it comes to bail reform, for example. And I was on a pilot for LA County to do that. There is a risk assessment model that you can use. It gets used all over the place, and we have to get rid of this blanket, particularly for felonies. Now, in LA County, we always had cite and release on misdemeanors. Didn't matter who you were, and we could hold occasionally, but it was the exception to the rule. Most misdemeanors, if you had good ID, we could identify you, you were released. If we didn't know who you were brought to jail, booked, fingerprinted, once identified, and released. So we had a very egalitarian system, if that's what, if the Nirvana folks wanted to look at it. In fact, they did. They said LA County had a fairly low incarceration rate in comparison to others. But then we took this to the step where it's nonviolent felonies we're going to do bail reform for as well, and they're not going to get bail, and it has to go to a judge, and it was and certain violent felonies as well. So we ratcheted up, and really it was unnecessary. We were much farther ahead than most of the people in other countries. And when we were first talking about bail reform, when we first started out it, we were looking at it from a risk assessment standpoint, where we use risk assessment tools to make those decisions. So those misdemeanors that we were keeping would go through the risk assessment tool, and then we would look at low-level felonies and do that. But they've
But
just done a blanket approach for most charges, and this is where we're at.
But the problem is the risk assessment seems to be out of favor now. I mean, we've got press release from the largest digital company saying risk assessment should not be used in pretrial release decisions. The science on risk assessments has come back and said they shouldn't be used. I mean, I've seen several reports on those in the last few years, but uh, but I want to highlight because I think what you've just said is very important. Because I mean, what California has done on misdemeanors is the same what New Jersey in their bail reform did. This wholesale cite and release of misdemeanors is something y'all did even before all this big wave
Yes.
of bail reform. And so uh, that's what, if you're going to get like New Jersey, when they got their first initial relief from their prison population or their jail population, their county jail population, it was from moving a lot of things to cite and release. And when you do that, especially like California, you're doing a charged base release system. Really, if you're charged with this, you're going to get released without bail. You're just going to get released over and over and over. And the criticism that I really have for that is look what's happened since California. When you switch to a cite and release mechanism release mechanism system for misdemeanors, and then all the stuff that's done for the felony jails, felony charges now. Look at your prison population. You're at 134 of your 137.5% or 0.4% of capacity. You have no room to hold anybody accountable. I did a podcast with the DA from Yolo County, and he was saying there's like an 80% failure to appear rate in
Yeah.
misdemeanors in California. Why do misdemeanors at all? Why prosecute them if you're setting up a system where you can't hold anybody, you release everybody, and you have an 80% failure to appear rate, and you can't go
Well,
get them?
in LA County, it was because of overcrowding. We were the
Sure,
first targeted before the state was, and so we had to maintain caps. And so it wasn't, we did it because we had to do it. And the problem with that is if somebody's in the game, if they're in the life, and nothing is derailing them from that life, meaning you just let them out,
sure.
eventually they're going to do felonies. You're going to, so
That's right. Your
you're going to,
misdemeanors
you're going to
becomes the
see,
training grounds for the felonies.
yes, you're going to see an increase into the more serious crimes. And it's going to impact your jail population and your prison population because now you can't just let them go because they're committing more serious crimes, right? Uh, and so my point in saying that is we didn't necessarily need to embrace this bail reform here in LA County as it was. It was more ideologically driven. And I
Mhm.
will tell you, the folks that I worked with on some of these programs are public defenders and they're people that lean left. And they said, it's really tough going into a room with some of these ideologically driven folks because as far as they're concerned, since we've been former prosecutors and public defenders, our programs aren't worth listening to because we're part of the system. We have to burn the system down and get rid of it. And yet these folks are consummate professionals who let's look for another way to get good outcomes out of these things. And they recognize that this is incremental. There's going to be small benefits,
Mhm.
but over time you can build on the things you learn and increase and be more successful. They recognize that, but the social justice warriors, the ideologically driven, reject all that.
What I see is the lesson from Harris County from the Democrat standpoint is that was a message meant for
Right.
the DAs that Soros has gotten elected so far. Do not change, or I will get somebody to run against you. And in a primary, I'll give them millions of dollars. Well, I mean, I know we need to wind up, but I want to talk about two things. The first is, it seems like the push for all these reforms is what we hear over and over: systemic racism. But
Hmm.
I would say, you can speak on this very, very well. So, what the jail population makeup was before all of these reforms. And now, after we've had all these pushes that we need this to address systemic racism, I mean, is the makeup of the jail any different now?
No, I've looked at the numbers, and so the makeup. So we had a decrease in the number
Hmm.
of people who are in jail, but the percentages are pretty consistent to what they
Hmm.
were before. Meaning, if you had a certain number of blacks that are in
Sure.
there, that you still have that same percentage, right? Same with Latinos and whites in California or in Los Angeles County, because that's where I kind of look.
And so
So you
that's when
have
I come back and say this whole systemic racism narrative, if it's incorrect, which I believe it is, and I think that proves it, but if that's incorrect, then who's the people getting hurt most by these policies? Because we generally do crime against our same racial group. So the very people they're trying to help is the people they're hurting the worst.
Yeah, and if you look at the number of the people who are dying of overdoses, it's
Hmm.
disproportionately black men. If you look at the people who are the victims of these crimes, it's disproportionately people of color. If you look at the abandonment of some of these communities by businesses, particularly
Hmm.
grocery stores and things like that, the food deserts are in those very same communities. When those businesses move out, jobs leave. Hope leaves, and the people most impacted are the very same people that they're saying they're doing this to help, right? So, because when I worked Compton, Compton had a large, we took over from the Compton police. They were so happy that we reduced the murders from 100 a year to down to 37 in just a few years. They would just wanted good quality policing so that they can
Hmm.
raise their kids, right? And businesses could roll in and they could get jobs locally and grandma can go to the school locally. And here's the other thing that they don't talk about. When crime goes up, what goes down? Property values go down. So grandma buys a house in a bad
Sure.
area in the 1970s. She holds on it all these years. She sees her equity going up because crime is going down. Now crime is going back up again. Her value's dropping. So who are they hurting? They're hurting the grandma, their grandma. They're hurting the people that have hung on and believed in the communities and believed in government. and the thing is they arrogantly ignore that data.
Well, I always say that these policies are not sustainable. And we've talked a little bit about Prop 47. They're talking about trying to think of ways to roll parts of it back. And we've also talked about the difficulty that Gascon is facing for his reelection, and that, he probably would have been successfully removed or recalled if they had certified that election. But what does the future hold for California? Be our little our seer for a moment. What does the future hold?
Well, I could tell you I'm going to have Nathan Hochman on the show in 2 weeks, and I'm going to challenge him. You can't just be a DA for LA County. You have to be a leader against this Soros-funded DA movement. And they are trying to recall Pamela Price up in Oakland. She's another Soros-funded DA up there. We got rid of Jessa Bodine, and they actually moved to the center up in San Francisco. They're actually enforcing the law, and so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we'll see a change in these DA's office, but the area that is really imperative is we need Sacramento. Right now, they have a supermajority in the assembly. They just got rid of the supermajority in the legislature, but it's still disproportionately Democrat. So they pretty much get whatever they want and pass whatever all laws that they want. And we need to slow the roll on their ability just to pass laws. And so people have to vote Republican just so we can break that supermajority. Because actually, one of the things they're trying to do, and it's not criminal justice, they want to end Prop 13, which limits
Sure.
property tax increases,
Hmm.
right? And that would be devastating for all Californians, but that's what's going on up there. They have an appetite to spend. They don't have an appetite to spend for success, and they want to just keep spending your money and fail and keep suggesting they're doing it for the right reasons, so it's okay. But so I'm actually hopeful that we're at least going in the right direction in LA County. I can't think of anybody who speaks positively other than the radical left about George Gascon. I think his days are numbered.
Well, I always hear from, the left when their policies are not working. We just need more time. We just need more time.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and then it'll work. And so far, you can give them all the time they want, and it's not working. But I wonder in California if this is not a continuing problem until there is a resolve to build further capacity. I mean, we're skirting the limits on the state prison system, even with all these things that I would consider bad bail reform, until we build more capacity. But like you said, I'm very hopeful. We can't, what we're doing now is not sustainable. So we
Well,
have to have a change.
the political leaders go along with the outcomes of those lawsuits right now. They're embracing them. So we have to
Yeah.
get political leaders that are willing to stand up and take them back to the Supreme Court. You're seeing that with the camping ordinance. I forget, I think an Oregon city has taken them back to court on that camping ordinance in the West Coast that's causing homelessness to explode. But we need to take that on, get the people the courage to challenge some of these fines, to re-examine it, right? To do the best you can. Because and the other part, and we do need to start building. We need to get rid of these because we have people in office who just want to get rid of all prisons.
Sure. Thank you for being our guest today. And I think this is so important. What you've mentioned are some of these things that we didn't even know, but I think California was one of the first. I mean, they taught the rest of the nation how to weaponize a federal lawsuit, and it's kind of scary. I would argue that what's going on in Harris County was through a weaponization of a federal lawsuit, O'Donnell versus Harris County, which has now been overturned so many times, and the Fifth Circuit has ruled en banc. So all the judges, except for maybe three, agree it should have never been filed, but they're still following it in Harris County for misdemeanors and thumbing their nose at the state. The state changed the law, and the reports to OCA, the Office of Court Administration, kind of have a little footnote. We're not doing that on misdemeanors because of this settlement, which has been reversed, but we're still following it. So, but thank you so much for talking with me, and kind of, I think very highly of you. You're so knowledgeable. I think we probably agree on 90 something percent of the issues, which is kind of scary, but I appreciate you talking to us and educating us about California. The stuff you know about California just runs circles around it. Anyone else that I would be able to educate Texas about California.
Well, I appreciate the compliment. I obviously have to do it for my show, Briefing with the Chief on KJDB.com. So catch me there. And this week, we are going to talk about anti-Semitism. I got somebody coming on. We're going to
Mhm.
talk about anti-Semitism on college campuses, which is a big deal here in
And
California
you've already
these
mentioned
days.
that I was on your podcast briefing
Yeah.
with the chief, which I highly recommend. I'd like for us to be the bell post, to be a resource to educate people. And I've seen, I think you do a lot of the same things. I saw an episode that y'all did where you're defending the broken windows theory,
Yes.
which seems like anything that works is now under attack by the left, which is the way they preempt it. So if they can just discredit it, suddenly law enforcement is less effective. So uh, keep up the good work. And thank you so much for
All right.
talking with me.
Thank you for listening, and come back for the next episode of The Bell Post.